In the autumn of 2023, Austria's Chancellor Karl Nehammer stood before cameras in Vienna and said something that European leaders had long whispered, but rarely declared aloud. Asylum applications, he argued, should be processed not on European soil, but in third countries far beyond the Union's borders. It was a demand that struck at the heart of decades of European legal orthodoxy. Nehammer wanted people intercepted before they reached Austria, their claims examined in facilities outside the EU, and the entire logic of arrival-based asylum turned inside out. This was not a fringe activist speaking. It was the head of government of a founding-era EU member, a country of roughly 9 million people nestled in the center of the continent. In a strategy paper circulated in early 2024, his government laid out an 11-point plan, calling for the suspension of Europe's obligation to process every claim lodged on its territory. Brussels balked. The European Commission insisted such schemes risked violating the 1951 Refugee Convention and the principle of non-refoulement, the bedrock rule against returning people to danger. Legal scholars warned it could unravel the Geneva framework entirely. Yet Nehammer pressed on, invoking the numbers that haunted Austrian politics. In 2022, Austria recorded over 112,000 asylum applications, one of the highest per capita totals in Europe, exceeding even Germany relative to population. For a small nation, the figure was staggering. Nehammer framed his gamble in stark terms. Either Europe controlled migration on its own terms, or the far right would seize the issue entirely. He was betting that a proposal once dismissed as extreme could be dragged into the mainstream by sheer persistence, and by the mounting anxiety spreading across European capitals. Critics called it cruel and unworkable. Supporters called it realism. Either way, Vienna had planted a flag. The question was no longer whether externalized asylum would be debated, but whether the idea Brussels had tried to stop would become continental policy. To understand why a small Alpine republic became the loudest voice for the hardest line, you have to go back to the moment the modern crisis began, to a corridor of highways and railways where more than 1 million people once walked toward the heart of Europe. Austria sits at a geographic pressure point. Landlocked, bordered by 8 countries, it has always been a corridor, a place people pass through rather than toward. During the Cold War, it was the seam between East and West. In 2015, it became something else entirely, the funnel of the largest movement of people Europe had seen since the Second World War. That summer, war in Syria, collapse in Afghanistan, and chaos in Iraq drove hundreds of thousands north, through Turkey, Greece, and up the Balkan route. The path ran through Serbia, Croatia, and Hungary, and then into Austria, where trains and buses carried the exhausted toward Germany. In September 2015, Vienna's Westbahnhof station filled with volunteers handing out water and blankets. Over the course of that year, more than 1 million migrants crossed Austrian territory. The vast majority intended to reach Germany, but tens of thousands stayed, and the sheer scale overwhelmed reception systems built for a fraction of the numbers. The images defined a generation of Austrian politics. In a single year, Austria received around 90,000 asylum applications, an extraordinary figure for a country its size. The initial mood of welcome, the so-called Willkommenskultur, curdled quickly into anxiety over housing, integration, and security. When a truck was found abandoned near the Hungarian border with 71 dead migrants inside, the horror crystallized public fear. Then came New Year's Eve in Cologne, just across the border, and reports of mass assaults hardened attitudes across the German-speaking world. The political center felt the ground shift beneath it. The Social Democrats and the People's Party, who had governed Austria in coalition for decades, watched the far-right Freedom Party surge in the polls. Voters wanted control, borders, limits. The 2015 shock did not fade. It rewired Austrian politics for the next decade, making migration the defining question of nearly every election that followed. The consensus that had held since the post-war era, that Austria was a generous asylum destination, cracked open. Into that fracture stepped a young, ambitious foreign minister who understood that whoever owned the migration issue would own the country's future. His name was Sebastian Kurz, and in 2015 he was Austria's foreign minister, barely 29 years old. Where others hesitated, Kurz acted. As the Balkan route heaved with people, he championed its closure, coordinating with Balkan states and Hungary to seal the corridor in early 2016. Fences went up, border controls tightened, and the flow that had defined the previous year slowed to a trickle. Kurz claimed credit, and the message resonated. Austria could shut its doors. It made him a national figure and, soon, a European one. In 2017, Kurz took control of the center-right People's Party, rebranded it, and campaigned on a hardline migration platform. He won. At 31, he became one of the youngest heads of government in the world, forming a coalition with the far-right Freedom Party. The alliance was extraordinary. The mainstream Conservative Party had adopted much of the rhetoric and policy of the populist right, and voters rewarded it. Kurz spoke of ending illegal migration, of cutting benefits for asylum seekers, of protecting Austrian identity. What had been fringe language in 2014 was now government policy. The significance ran deeper than one man. Kurz demonstrated that migration restriction was not a liability but a winning strategy, and the entire spectrum shifted to follow. The Social Democrats, traditionally the party of solidarity, began emphasizing border control. Even centrist voices adopted the vocabulary of limits and returns. Austria became a laboratory for how a wealthy, liberal democracy could move rightward on migration without the sky falling. Kurz's government collapsed in 2019 amid the Ibiza scandal, when secret footage sank the Freedom Party's leader, but Kurz returned to power that same year, this time with the Greens. Remarkably, the hardline migration stance survived the coalition change intact. It was no longer a partisan position. It had become the Austrian baseline. By the time Kurz finally left politics in 2021, the framework was set. Fast deportations, closed routes, skepticism of Brussels. That framework would now collide directly with the European Union's own grand project to overhaul asylum, and the clash would define the years ahead. For years, the European Union had labored over a single, sprawling reform, the Pact on Migration and Asylum. Finally adopted in 2024 after nearly a decade of negotiation, it promised a common system, faster screening at external borders, and a mechanism of mandatory solidarity, meaning member states would either accept relocated asylum seekers or pay into a shared fund. Brussels called it a historic compromise. Vienna called it insufficient. Austria's objection was fundamental. The pact still rested on the premise that asylum claims were processed inside the European Union, on European soil. That was precisely the model Austria wanted to abandon. Nehammer's government argued that the pact, for all its complexity, did nothing to stop people from arriving in the first place, and that solidarity payments were no substitute for genuine deterrence. Austria had long complained it bore a disproportionate burden, pointing to those record application numbers and to secondary movements from other member states. The clashes were specific and repeated. Austria blocked the accession of Bulgaria and Romania into the Schengen free travel zone in late 2022, wielding its veto to protest what it called failures in external border protection. The move infuriated fellow members and revealed how far Vienna would go to make its point. Austria demanded EU funding for physical border barriers, an idea the Commission had long resisted spending on fences. It pushed for expanded lists of safe countries of origin to speed rejections. And above all, it pressed the case for offshore processing, the concept Brussels had explicitly ruled out as incompatible with European law. Where the Commission drew a line, Austria leaned against it. The European Court of Justice and human rights lawyers formed one wall. The Refugee Convention formed another. Austrian officials argued these frameworks, written in a different era, no longer matched reality. This was the crux of the confrontation. A member state insisting that the legal architecture of European asylum was obsolete, and that only by moving processing beyond the Union's borders could migration be controlled. But Austria was not inventing this idea from nothing. Across the English Channel, another government had already tried to make it real, in a scheme that would echo across the continent. In April 2022, the United Kingdom announced a plan that stunned observers and electrified the European debate. Asylum seekers arriving irregularly in Britain, chiefly those crossing the Channel in small boats, would be flown more than 6,000 kilometers to Rwanda in East Africa. There, their claims would be processed, and if successful, they would be resettled in Rwanda, not Britain. The scheme, agreed with Kigali for an initial payment of £120 million, was the boldest attempt yet to externalize asylum entirely. The logic was deterrence. If crossing the Channel led not to Britain but to Central Africa, the government argued, the incentive to make the dangerous journey would collapse. Critics were appalled. Refugee organizations called it a betrayal of legal obligations. The plan faced immediate legal challenge. In June 2022, the first deportation flight was halted on the tarmac after an intervention by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. For 2 years, the scheme was tied up in British courts. In November 2023, the UK Supreme Court ruled it unlawful, finding Rwanda was not a safe third country and that deportees risked being returned onward to danger. The government responded with fresh legislation declaring Rwanda safe by law, a remarkable attempt to override the courts. Not a single asylum seeker was ever actually removed under the plan before it was scrapped by an incoming government in 2024. Yet its failure did not kill the idea. It legitimized it. The very fact that a major Western democracy, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, had seriously pursued offshore processing, changed what was politically thinkable. Across Europe, leaders watched closely. The concept of a third country hub, once confined to think tank papers on the far right, had entered the mainstream through the front door of British government. Austria's advocates pointed to Rwanda as proof that their proposals were not fantasy but part of a genuine continental experiment. Denmark had already explored a similar deal with Rwanda. Vienna sensed momentum. What Britain had attempted and abandoned, others were preparing to attempt anew, and the mechanism that would make it real was the machinery of deportation itself. For Austria, tough rhetoric means little without removal, and removal is where the machinery grinds hardest against reality. By 2023, Austria was issuing tens of thousands of deportation orders annually, yet actual returns lagged far behind. The gap between paper and practice became the government's obsession. Interior Minister Gerhard Karner pushed relentlessly for faster procedures, expanded detention capacity, and a longer list of so-called safe countries of origin. If a nation was deemed safe, an asylum claim could be rejected quickly and the applicant sent back. The logic was simple. The execution was not. Austria wanted to resume deportations to Afghanistan and Syria, two of the largest source countries for asylum seekers. But after the Taliban seized Kabul in August 2021, the European Court of Human Rights and Austria's own courts blocked returns to a country in collapse. Syria, still ruled by Bashar al-Assad until late 2024, posed the same legal wall. Vienna argued that certain regions were stable enough for returns. Human rights lawyers countered that sending people back to torture or death violated the principle of non-refoulement, the bedrock of the 1951 Refugee Convention. The obstacles were not only legal but logistical. Deportation requires a destination country willing to accept its citizens, valid travel documents, and a flight. Afghanistan's Taliban government was internationally unrecognized. Charter deportation flights cost hundreds of thousands of euros each. Countries like Iraq and Iran frequently refused to cooperate, denying nationality or stalling paperwork for months. Austria responded by tying visa policy and development aid to cooperation on returns, a tactic borrowed from Brussels. Karner floated deportation centers, detention for rejected applicants, and even the idea of returns to third countries rather than home nations. Each proposal drew condemnation from Amnesty International and Austrian NGOs, who documented families held in limbo for years. Yet the political direction never wavered. Every failed removal became an argument for harder rules, and every court ruling became evidence that the system was rigged against enforcement. The frustration built a pressure that needed a release valve. And in the autumn of 2024, Austrian voters found one, delivering a verdict that shattered decades of political consensus and pushed the entire deportation debate into uncharted territory. On September 29, 2024, Austria crossed a threshold it had never crossed before. The far-right Freedom Party, the FPO, won a national election outright, capturing 28.8% of the vote and finishing first for the first time in the party's history. At its head stood Herbert Kickl, a hardliner who had served as interior minister and built his career on the language of remigration, a term borrowed from Europe's identitarian movement that implied the mass return of migrants. The result stunned observers, but it did not come from nowhere. It was the culmination of a decade that had begun with the 2015 crisis and hardened with every subsequent shock. Kickl campaigned on sealing borders, halting asylum entirely during emergencies, and building what he called Fortress Austria. He spoke of a Volkschancellor, a people's chancellor, a phrase with dark historical echoes that critics linked to the 1930s. The FPO demanded suspension of family reunification, an asylum freeze, and defiance of EU rules it deemed unworkable. The conservative OVP, led by Chancellor Karl Nehammer, had already moved rightward on migration, yet Nehammer refused to serve under Kickl, calling him a security risk. For months, Austria's political system convulsed as coalition talks failed. President Alexander Van der Bellen initially declined to hand Kickl a mandate to form a government, an extraordinary intervention. Eventually, the OVP, the Social Democrats, and the liberal NEOS assembled a fragile three-party coalition to keep the FPO from power, installing Christian Stocker as Chancellor in March 2025. But the far-right's exclusion from office did not blunt its influence. Every mainstream party had already absorbed its core demands. The debate's center of gravity had shifted so far that policies once considered extreme now defined the negotiating baseline. Restriction, deportation, and externalization were no longer fringe positions to be resisted. They were the terms on which government itself was built. Austria had shown that a party need not govern to win. It only needed to move the entire field toward its position. And across the continent, other governments were watching, learning, and quietly adopting the very ideas Vienna had championed. What began as Austrian provocation was becoming European practice. The clearest example emerged in Italy, where Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni signed a deal in November 2023 to build asylum processing centers in Albania, outside the European Union. Migrants intercepted at sea would be transferred to Albanian facilities while their claims were assessed. The first transfers began in October 2024. Italian courts repeatedly blocked the scheme, sending detainees back and referring the case to the European Court of Justice. Yet the principle survived, and the European Commission, once hostile, began openly studying return hubs in third countries. The idea Austria had championed for years was now on Brussels' own agenda. Denmark had traveled the road even earlier. Under a social democratic government, Copenhagen passed a 2021 law allowing asylum seekers to be transferred to partner countries abroad and pursued talks with Rwanda. Denmark stripped residency from some Syrians, declaring parts of Damascus safe, and drove asylum applications to their lowest levels in decades. A center-left government was executing policies once branded xenophobic. Germany, long the destination that Austria's 2015 arrivals had marched toward, reversed course too. In September 2024, Berlin reintroduced controls on all 9 of its land borders, suspending the open travel promise of the Schengen zone. The move followed deadly knife attacks and the rise of the far-right AfD, which won a state election in Thuringia that same month. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's government and later the coalition under Friedrich Merz, hardened rules on deportation and benefits. The Netherlands declared an asylum crisis. Sweden reported net negative migration for the first time in decades. Poland suspended asylum rights at its Belarus border. Across the continent, the vocabulary had converged. Externalization, safe third countries, return hubs, border controls. Positions that Vienna had been isolated in defending were now shared by governments of the left, the right, and the center. The European Union's own Pact on Migration and Asylum, adopted in 2024, embraced faster border procedures and expanded the safe country concept. Austria was no longer the outlier straining against Brussels orthodoxy. It had helped write the new orthodoxy. The question was no longer whether Europe would follow. It was whether anything could reverse the direction. By 2025, the transformation was nearly complete. The ideas Austria had pushed at the fringe of European debate had migrated to its very core. Offshore processing, once dismissed as a fantasy of the hard right, was being actively pursued by Italy, studied by the European Commission, and legislated in Denmark. The externalization of asylum, sending the responsibility for refugees beyond Europe's borders, was no longer a taboo. It was a policy option openly discussed in the corridors of Brussels. Consider the trajectory. In 2015, Austria's decision to wave migrants toward Germany symbolized a continent's open door. Less than a decade later, that same country had become a laboratory for restriction, and the whole of Europe had entered the experiment. The UK's Rwanda scheme, though abandoned by a new government in 2024, had already normalized the concept of shipping asylum seekers to a third country. Maloney's Albania centers kept the model alive despite legal defeats. The European Union's new pact enshrined accelerated border procedures and detention. Every element that Vienna had demanded now appeared, in some form, in mainstream European law. The obstacles remained real. Courts continued to strike down deportation flights. The principle of non-refoulement still stood, at least on paper. Human rights organizations still documented families held in limbo, children in detention, and returns to countries in crisis. The gap between political promise and legal reality had not closed. But the direction of travel was unmistakable, and it pointed one way. What made Austria's story significant was not that a small nation had won an argument. It was that the argument itself had ceased to be controversial. A party could finish first in a national election, on a platform of remigration, and still see its rivals adopt its core demands. Governments of the left executed policies once branded extremist. The center of European politics had shifted so far that yesterday's radicalism was today's consensus. Austria did not merely test the immigration policy Brussels tried to stop. It proved that policy could win. The proposals that once lived on the political margins now define the mainstream. In the end, the lesson of Vienna was simple and stark. The fringe has become the center.